Justification, I am saved, right? That's the declaration of righteousness. You and I, we can't have a relationship with the living God. He's holy. He said this all throughout the Old Testament, on into the New Testament. Be holy as I am holy. Well, I can't do that. The law didn't allow me to do that because the law only told me what holiness was. It could not make me holy. But as Paul said in Galatians, the law was a tutor to lead us to Christ. Why? Because he is holy. So in his holiness, in his righteousness, we can have a relationship with God the Father. Then, once we are justified, declared righteous, and at this point I am saved, we move into I am being saved, which is a process that happens throughout the life of a born-again Christian. Then once and this process is really working out the righteousness of Christ. And this is the part where you're being transformed and conformed to the image of the Son and away from the world. And then at the end of our life, we go through a process called glorification. And it's here where you got, I am saved, I'm being saved, and I will be saved, right? Here we talked about Old Testament support for the future glorification. You remember talking about that? We looked at a lot of different verses out of Job, Daniel, Isaiah. These guys knew. The Old Testament prophets, they knew that there was going to be a resurrection one day. And this has always been established in the saints of old. They knew that something big was going to happen, that this life was not over. Now think of the time during Jesus' days. You had a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the religious body, the ruling religious body of Israel. And the Sanhedrin was made up of two groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, the Pharisees, they held more to the tradition of the prophets. They knew that there was going to be a resurrection. They counted on that resurrection. But did you know the Sanhedrin, who was actually the dominant during the first century, within this, the Sadducees, which were dominant in the Sanhedrin during the time of Jesus, they did not believe in a resurrection. They didn't even believe in angels. They didn't believe in anything like that. They thought right now is what there is. That's why when the Apostle Paul got into a confrontation with the Sanhedrin, what did he do? He talked about the resurrection. Why? Because he knew the Pharisees and Sadducees would start butting heads and yelling and screaming. That's exactly what happened. He used the Sanhedrin against itself in order to excuse him out of the way. But for the most part, the Sadducees, I got to say it, I'm sorry. The Sadducees or sad you see, yeah. I could not help it. It's just right there all the time. What do you do? So the Sadducees, they're just a sad group of people, but the Pharisees, even though we give the Pharisees a hard time, they did know that the resurrection was coming. They did hold to the prophets and the teachings of what we call the Old Testament today, in that sense. Then we looked at the resurrection and glorification, how the Bible teaches that at death, the spirit of believers go immediately into the presence of God. But also then, the physical body is going to be resurrected. And we talked about that out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, right? So we looked at some pretty neat things there. Then we went to, when does the resurrection take place? And that's when we established the time of the resurrection and when all that is going to work and how it's going to work. And it's actually going to work at different times. 2 different times, but yet it's considered the first resurrection. And we looked at that all throughout 1 Thessalonians 4 and Revelation. Now we're moving on to this last part. This is a continuation from last week. In your outline, it's titled, Christians Will Fully Reflect the Character and Image of God. Because you ever wonder, what am I going to look like? I mean, am I going to look like this? You ever ask yourself that question? Is there something good, or is it going to be better than this? You know, what am I going to look like? Well, as we noted before, the ultimate goal of our sanctification or salvation is to conform to the image of Jesus. That's what God the Father is working. That's what the Spirit of God is working. He's working in us to conform us to the image of Jesus, not to be Jesus. We want to make sure that we differentiate that from what we're talking about here, because there are some religions that think we are going to be a Jesus, right? and that we are being formed into that image, or into that person, in a sense. Scripture tells us that God is transforming us into the image, not Jesus, but like Jesus. There's only one God, so we can't be God. But he's working in us to such an extent that in order for God to have a relationship with us, we have to be righteous. So he's working in us to be like his son so that the God can have a relationship with us. But he's doing it through his righteousness, not our righteousness, right? Our nature is standing in the righteousness of Christ. Our nature alone doesn't have the ability to have a relationship with God. It has to be in the position of the righteousness of Christ. You see what I mean? So that's what he's doing. He's conforming us using that righteousness. Take a look, if you would. We're going to look at a lot of scripture tonight. So we're going to move right along, okay? 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, if you would, please. Because it's really important to me, personally, that we understand this glorification. Because like, what is it, 1 Thessalonians, is it chapter 4, verse 18, right around there? It says, comfort one another with these words. Yeah, comfort one another. We, in times of distress, in times of anxiety, in times of hostility and difficulties, we can comfort one another that there's going to be a glorification. So look at 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. It says this, Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is. So we will be like him, and we will see him. Well, you can't see him if you're not like him, because God can't have a relationship with something that's not of him. But in the righteousness of Christ, we are of him, so we'll be able to see him, therefore we will be like him. Right? So being like him includes both physical changes and spiritual changes. And John gives us some insight into this. If we're going to be like him, according to what the Apostle John said here in 1 John 2, so we have to ask ourselves this question. Well, what does Jesus look like? Anybody know what Jesus looks like right now? Well, yeah, he's Jewish, so he's not a white European with blue eyes, blonde hair, right? I mean, so many of the pictures we see. No, he's a Jew. Yeah, when he was on earth, he looked like a Jew. Yeah, he would have had darker skin, and they think that he was probably about 5 foot tall. Back in the first century, they were shorter back then, supposedly. I don't know. But anyhow, Jesus would look Jewish, but we don't know what he looked like. But what does he look like now? Okay, let's go there. Revelation chapter 1. The Apostle John, who wrote in 1 John 2:3 that we will be like him, actually saw him post-resurrection. So we can gain a basic comprehension, understanding of what Jesus looks like based upon what the Apostle John saw post-resurrection. It was, absolutely. John the Beloved, the Apostle John. That's exactly right. Now, John gives us insight into Jesus, what he looks like post-resurrection, or you could say post-glorification. All right, because Jesus, his body was glorified. His physical body was glorified. Revelation chapter 1. Let me read verses 12 through 15 here, and we'll kind of look at a few things. Now keep in mind here, the Apostle John is writing this letter to the 7 churches. This is in the 90s AD. Jesus had already been ascended. He already ascended. He's been in heaven for 30, 40 years, okay? And then he appears to the Apostle John, and this is what happens. John says this, Then I, John, turned to see the voice that was speaking with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of the lampstands I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe, reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it had been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held, let's stop there, verse 15, 1 through 15. So John gives us some insight into what Jesus looks like post-glorification. Number one is this: he's clothed in a robe. That's what John sees. He sees Jesus clothed in a robe. Now, keep in mind, anybody familiar with the first fruits of the Old Testament? First fruits of offering to God? So take, if you will, in your mind, you are a farmer in the Old Testament. And what you do, once a crop comes up, you go and you grab the best portion of that, you take it to the priest and you offer it to God, right? You're offering to God the first fruits. And then if God accepts that, then your thought process is this: then the goodness of that first fruits offered, the rest of the farm, the rest of the produce, the vegetation will be like the first fruit, because it was accepted by God, and He'll honor the sacrifice, and He'll give you a good product. Well, Paul tells us in Corinthians that Jesus is our first fruit, that He was glorified, and in the manner that He was glorified, His people will be. We will follow in that manner. So Paul was using the Jewish thinking, which makes sense, right? Because Paul was Jewish. He was using the Jewish thinking and trying to help us understand that Jesus is the first fruit, and as Jesus is, so will we be in the image of that. Not be Him, but in the image of that, right? So the first fruit was offered, which is Jesus. The rest of the crop, the Christians, will be like the fruit, since the first fruit was accepted by the Father, okay? So here we see Jesus as clothed in a robe. Jump over, keep your finger there, but jump over at Revelation 19, verse 8. Now, what is the church called in the New Testament? What does Paul and John often call us? Does he call us the groom, or does he call us the bride? Well, he calls us the bride, right? Calls us the bride. I know that's an open-ended question because we get called all kinds of things in the New Testament. But that's where I was going with that. Look at chapter 19, verse 8. Now remember, chapter 19, this is the chapter where Jesus comes back to earth. Chapter 19, verse 8 says this: it was given to her. Now who's her? You got to go back to verse 7. It says, and His bride has made herself ready. The church in the New Testament is always in the feminine. In the original Koine Greek language, the church is in the feminine. So we are always called the her, or the she, or the bride, all right? And Jesus is always in the masculine. He's the groom. So here, the bride, according to verse 8 now, is to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. It appears that what John saw, post-glorification Jesus, in a robe, is very similar to what we are going to look like, clothed in a righteousness, some form of a righteousness. We're just going to be clothed in it. See that? To clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean. We're not going to fully grasp any of this until we see it. But I'm trying to equate, trying to give us something so we have some comprehension here. But you can see the relationship there, right? Okay, so, number 2 here. Jesus is wearing specific items. Back in Revelation chapter 1, 12 through 15. Jesus is wearing items that identify His position. Okay, the golden sash across His neck, or His chest rather, it recognizes Him as a priest and judge. It's interesting that Jesus actually, do you know what tribe Jesus came from? Judah. How many tribes are there? 12. Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. What was special about the tribe of Judah? The kings came from the tribe of Judah. There was only one king that didn't come from the tribe of Judah. Do you know who that was? I mean, one of the main kings. Obviously, Saul. Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin. Well, Saul got booted, right? Because the Spirit of God left him. He got booted. But ever since then, ever since David on, the kings were from the tribe of Judah. Now, what's interesting here, after King Solomon, the nation of Israel split into 2 groups, right? The northern and the southern. You got Judah, which had 2 tribes, and then you had Israel, the northern part, above Jerusalem, way above Jerusalem there, had 10 tribes. All the northern part never had a king who was from the tribe of Judah. Judah was in the southern part. So Jerusalem, kind of the heartbeat, Where that's God's focus is Jerusalem. It seems like obviously all of Israel, but Jerusalem is very special to God. Well, Judah was in the southern part, and the kings all throughout time were all part of Judah. The northern part that split up, they were a mess, but the southern part were kings. Well, Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah, so he has kind of this royalty in him. But when we read in Hebrews, we read that Jesus is also in the order of Melchizedek. And you know what's special about Melchizedek? Back in Genesis, when Abraham remember when Abraham took care of the kings that were causing all kinds of problems, and he took some things back, and he offered an offering to Melchizedek. Melchizedek lived in Salem. You know where Salem is? Jerusalem. Right, it's modern-day Jerusalem. Now, this is way before Moses, way before they were in the promised land, okay? But here you have, so this is way before the tribes are established, way before the law, the Mosaic law is established. Here you have Salem, and you have in Salem a guy who's Melchizedek, who is a priest and a king. So Jesus comes from the line of Judah, but he's in the line, he's similar, or he's like Melchizedek in that Jesus is both a priest and a king. King from the line of the kings, and obviously king of all, but he's also a priest in that he is the one that goes in between us. So when the veil was torn at the cross, you no longer have to go to a priest to have that priest then as an advocate for you go to God in the most holy place. Jesus became that advocate. He became that priest. So we can go into the Holy of Holies now, so to speak, because of Jesus being our high priest. So he's both a king and a priest. Well, right here, John recognizes that golden sash on his chest, and he recognizes him as priest, but it also tells us he's a judge. Maybe we'll have some type of clothing that identifies our eternal role. I don't know. I mean, Jesus has clothing that identifies his role. Will we? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? I don't know. Some of this we have to speculate. We'll talk about it later when we get to heaven. Right now, we have to wonder. Number 3, something else we see here is Jesus' head and hair are white. What that means, it's not necessarily, I don't think that John saw like the white that we see. He saw a purity here. Probably like almost an invisible, just a clean purity. And because this is what this head of white hair is signifying, purity. But we will be pure also. Does that mean we're all going to have kind of like a white hair? So if you have white hair now, you're just you're ahead of the ball game. And maybe there's a little bit of a purity there that's greater than some of you guys with darker hair. I just shave all mine off so you don't see anything. But we're all coming to church Sunday morning with dyed white hair. But it makes you wonder, are we going to look similar with that purity? Did you know that Daniel, the prophet, saw Jesus? Which is interesting, because he saw Jesus pre-glorification. It's called a Christophany. So from a theological term here is this. Anytime there's an appearance of Jesus, and this is debatable, and I certainly understand that, but anytime there's an appearance of the Son in the Old Testament, it's called a Christophany. Think of Abraham. Who were the 3 that went to Abraham? There were 2 angels, and then there was another. Yeah. Who was the one in with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? We believe that to be, we think it's Jesus, so we call that a Christophany. It's an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament, or we call it the pre-incarnate Christ. But look at this just for a moment. Look at Daniel chapter 9, or chapter 7, verse 9, and we'll jump right back here. I just want you to see this. This is really cool, because what Daniel sees here, I think, is what John sees, but what's weird is you have a pre-incarnate and then a post-incarnate view of Jesus. So Daniel chapter 7, verse 9 says this. I kept looking. Now, Daniel's having a vision at this point, and it was about the 4 beasts and the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days. This is the one we want to look at. I kept looking in verse 9 until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were burning fire. And then he goes on and explains a little bit more. But what we kind of think is that Daniel actually saw Jesus here. So the person that John is describing in Revelation 1 is the person that Daniel saw in Revelation 7 or in Daniel 7. Isn't that something? Kind of an interesting thought. But there's no difference. It doesn't seem to be much of a difference. Okay, back to Revelation 1. Look at verse 14. It says, Jesus' eyes were like a flame of fire. You know, our ability to see might be a bit different than how it is now. Today we see with the eyes that are physical. But in the glorified state, it seems like we'll have some type of eyes that we are going to see in the spiritual realm. The fire probably signifies some form of judgment, okay? Because usually when there's fire, there's judgment. But it's interesting that John saw that description. So it makes you wonder, you know, is there some form of seeing in heaven with the eyes that we have now, but in a spiritual sense when the body's glorified? All right? Obviously, we're not going to be all seeing everything, but we're going to be able to see something. And this might be the answer right here. Next, his feet like bronze, like glow. Maybe we'll have something on our feet. I can't help but think that what we have in the world today, I'm convinced of this, by the way, what we have in the world today is a mirror image or similarity of what's already established. Because remember, you've heard me say this before, a creator can only create what the creator knows. Like you can only create something what you know. And what you know is what you have around you, right? And then you can build on that. And, we think of the tree of life. Is it because there was a tree on the earth? Then, therefore, there's something like that in heaven? Or was it already established in the presence of God, and then he took from what he knew and established the physical part of it on earth? You see what I mean? We talked about water. Moses' tabernacle was a mirror image of heaven. That wasn't something that God just kind of said, let me just think of something here. He actually took that from what was already established. So it's pretty interesting how that works. I think what we have now, so like we wear shoes, even back then they wore sandals. It makes you wonder, was that something because that is something that is of God, and being in the image of God, we kind of have this feel of some of the things that are already established by God in the heavens, so we kind of do those types of things. You see what I mean? We wear clothes. In the glorified state, we're going to be clothed with righteousness, that linen of righteousness. You see what I mean? It's kind of interesting. Just food for thought on that. It also says here in Revelation, his voice was like the sound of many waters. It could be that we will be making sounds that others can hear. There will be some type of communication that takes place in a verbal sense. John heard Jesus speak. So could that be that we too are going to be speaking in heaven? You see what I mean? Let's look at some other areas that may give us some insight into what we will be like. Look at John chapter 20, verse 19. And take some of this, understand that we got to take some of this with a grain of salt on some of it, because Scripture is just not jumping out and saying, this is what you're going to look like. But if we're going to be in the image of Christ, 1 John chapter 2, then what Jesus looks like gives us an idea of what we could be looking like. So that's what I'm trying to point out here. John chapter 20, verse 19. John chapter 20, if I can get to it, verse 19 says this. So when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut, where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, peace be with you. This is post death, okay? Post-resurrection, pre-ascension, okay? So it's post-resurrection here. And look at, in conjunction with that, look at Luke chapter 24, verse 39. Luke 24, 39. It says this. Luke 24, 39 says, "See my hands," Jesus says, "my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for his spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." You know, it looks like we're going to have a form that is somewhat solid, but can move without hindrance. If we're going to be in the image of Christ, in this sense, then we're going to have form. We're not going to just turn into this energy that happens to be omnipresent. See what I mean? We're going to have form. We're going to be clothed with a robe. We're going to have form that is can we say it this way, spiritually tangible? Look at Luke chapter 24 here, just going to continue on verses 40 through 43. Here, and when Jesus had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they still could not believe it because of their joy and amazement, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish. And he took it and ate it before them. It makes you wonder, is there some form of food? I don't know. Maybe some of you are hoping and praying for that. The right food. Lord, if there's going to be Brussels sprouts in heaven, we need to talk about restructuring something here. You know what I mean? But this kind of takes us to Revelation 22a. Let me show you this. In Revelation 22a, we're talking now the New Jerusalem. Remember, our eternal home, according to Revelation 21:22, is going to be the New Jerusalem. Right? This New Jerusalem comes out of heaven. This is the place that that Jesus is creating for us, that's attached to the Father's house, that he promised the disciples. Where I go, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I'm going to come back for you. So he's preparing this New Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's very special to God. Matter of fact, our eternal home is going to be called Jerusalem. All right? So it would be very proper to be praying for Jerusalem and getting that Jerusalem in your head, because our home eternally is Jerusalem, which is kind of interesting. But in this New Jerusalem, Revelation 22a says this. It says, in the middle of its streets, in this New Jerusalem, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, and it's bearing fruit. You know, we have a complexity, I think, of understanding fruit in the eternal realm. But this is what it says. And back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 22 and 24, you have the tree of life in the garden. Right? The tree of life in the garden. And God says, hey, get them out of that garden. I don't want them eating from the tree of life. So he boots them out of the garden and puts an angel right there so they can't go back in the garden. And then we have the flood and everything, which wipes all that stuff out. But then all of a sudden we have this tree of life in the New Jerusalem. So the tree of life then, one of the ideas is this. People have wondered how were Adam and Eve, if Adam and Eve never sinned, how would they be sustained eternally? Were they just naturally in a form where their bodies could live eternally? Or was this tree of life a means of keeping them from like the law of entropy, you know, from the bondage of decay? Would they eat the fruit every now and then and it just sustained them eternally? Nobody really knows what the tree of life was there for. But here we have it pop up again in the New Jerusalem. Is this something that we're going to eat that helps sustain eternality? I mean, you know, it just makes you wonder. I can't give you the full answer on that because I don't know. And Revelation chapter 2, verse 7. If you look at that for a moment, let me read this. Revelation 2:7 says, "He who has an ear, let him hear." Obviously, this is Jesus talking because he always said this, didn't he? But then he says, "Hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." You know, he's talking about this tree of life. Where's the paradise of God? It's the New Jerusalem. We just read it in Revelation 22a. So we see the tree of life in the garden. It has some functionality to the point that God said, get them out. I don't want them eating of it in their fallen state, right? But they didn't eat it prior to the fallen state, which is kind of interesting from what we know. And then he tells the churches, these 7 churches, the one who overcomes, that's the one who's a believer. That's the one who's a Christian, and I'll grant to that one to eat from the tree of life. And then in Revelation 22a, we have the tree of life in the New Jerusalem. Are we eating? Jesus ate. Did he need to eat? He didn't need to eat, but he did to prove to the disciples that this was him. Back to Revelation 22b here, the second part of the verse, I want to show you that. Revelation 22, second part. Says this, this tree is going to bear 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, which now we have to question time. As we know it, time is a fourth dimension property, right? And fourth dimension is a physical property. And time is relative based upon the gravitational pull of whatever body that time is near. So if you take a clock and you move it to Mount Everest, and then you put a clock at Death Valley, you're going to have, the time is going to be different, right? Because of gravitational pull. So how does that affect? I mean, this isn't really a physical state. This is a spiritual state. But yet there seems to be some physical qualities here. And what is this whole time thing? Why did he say every month? It's just a weird thing. I don't know. But I can't help but think that we have some form of time, not because God created time for us, but because there was some form of time already created. You see? And then with the physical property, the fourth dimension of the physical property, we have time that's relative to us. But is there spiritual time that's relative to that? You see what I mean? I don't know. It's hard to say. We'll find out. I'm certain of it. Now, it goes on to say here in verse 22, yielding its fruits every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Now, that's where nations here is actually just different groups of people. It means ethnicity. It's different groups of people. There's going to be all kinds of groups. I think it's a bad translation. Anybody else have a different translation than nations right there? I just don't think it's a really good translation, in my opinion. So when you're in the New Jerusalem, you're going to have all different types of groups of people that are there. Because there's Christians that expand from the Chinese to the Europe to Mexico to, everywhere, to the Alaskans. You have different types. So all these different types of people within the New Jerusalem, then he's talking about eating and then this healing or this sustaining of life. I don't know. Pretty interesting. Look at Jude verse. How many chapters are in Jude before you go there? All right. Yeah, you're too smart. Jude verse 24. Jude verse 24. Jude verse 24 says this. Now to him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to make you stand in the presence of his glory blameless with great joy. So I don't know about the food thing, but I do know about this, that in our glorification state, we are going to be blameless. Blameless. We're going to be blameless. That means all the sin that we've ever done on earth, we will understand has been washed. And there's not going to be any residual, because our sin nature will have been, at this point, eradicated. So we're going to stand in the presence of Almighty God in a glorified state, blameless, clothed in righteousness. Imagine living every day of your life, no guilt, no shame, no concern about sin. That's how it's going to be in our glorified state. No spots or wrinkles. So Paul says, comfort one another with these words. All right, in the remaining minutes here, oh my goodness gracious, Mike. Let me give you some more realities here on the resurrected, glorified bodies. Number one, it will be glorified. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. You know we couldn't continue on with this without going to 1 Corinthians 15, because the Apostle Paul, you can almost feel his excitement when he writes this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, let me read verses 42 and the beginning of verse 43. It says this, moreover, we are, nope. 1 Corinthians 15, 42. I don't know what I'm doing. It says here, so also is the resurrection of the body. So also it is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. Let's stop right here. Glory here is literally speaking of being bright or shining brightness, splendor, or radiance. That's what this word means when he says glory. Being bright or shining brightness, splendor, radiance. So we are going to be in glory. Bright, shining, brightness, splendor, radiance. That's purity. It's exactly what it is. It's going to be that robe of righteousness. It's going to be that purity on our head. That's right. We'll give the second part of verse 43. It says that, is sown, it is sown, the body is sown in weakness, but it is raised in power. Our physical body is weak. It's going to be sown, it's going to be placed into the ground. But when it is raised at the time of the resurrection for glorification, it's going to be one of power. No more is your body going to be weak, and no more is my body going to be weak. Look at verse 46. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. Our body will be spiritual. That's why we have to separate the physical a little bit from the spiritual here, because our bodies are going to be spiritual, but yet there's something tangible about the bodies. But think of the angels. Think of the demons. There's something tangible there too, right? They're just not blobs. Throughout the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament with the Apostle John, when he saw an angel, they described them, and they look like a big person. You know what I mean? There's something tangible, but they were spiritual. Look at verse 53. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. So this body in the glorification state will be immortal. It won't be able to perish. It won't be able to die. When it's glorified, it's an established eternal existence. Now, people will also probably, I think they will certainly, be able to recognize one another. That's a big question. Will I know anybody in heaven? Look, who you are, your knowledge will go to heaven with you. It'll just be pure. Look at Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. And we'll be closing up here pretty soon. Matthew 8:11. It says this. Jesus speaking, he says, I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Well, how do you know who they are? Because you're going to know. We're going to know. We're not even going to know who we are. We're going to know who Isaac is. We're going to know who Abraham is. And you know what else is really neat? This is one of the most coolest events that ever happened. Luke chapter 9, verse 30 and verse 33. Look at this. I mean, I think it's a cool event. I had to write a paper on this, and I learned to really, really like this. Luke chapter 9, 30 and 33 says this. Okay, well, first let me tell you this. This is the Mount of Transfiguration, okay? You remember the event, right? And it says, and behold, two men were talking with Jesus, and they were Moses and Elijah. On the Mount of Transfiguration, guess who appears? Moses and Elijah. Look at verse 33. And as these were leaving Jesus, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not realizing what he was saying. Well, you know, Peter, he was one of those that spoke first, then thought later. These guys were heaven bound, you know what I mean? We don't need to make a little hut for them. But you can see what he was saying. He's saying, look, I recognize I've never met Moses. I've never met Elijah. And there's no pictures of these guys. But that's Moses and Elijah. Even Peter knew who they were. And they were in such a form that Peter thought it was reasonable to say, hey, let's make a little hut for them. Isn't that interesting? Kind of gives us a little bit more insight. Okay, last section here in your outline. The entire creation will be renewed. We can't conclude without recognizing that God, what he does is he fixes everything. Romans chapter 8, verse 19 through 23. Romans 8, 19 through 23. Let me read this right away here. Romans 8, 19 says this, for the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for an adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. So all corruption, chaos, and death in the created order is due to humanity's fall into sin, right? Everything. No matter what God created that's out there, however, we don't know how far it is out there. There's a lot of different theories that it wraps around, or does it go eternally? Likely it doesn't go eternally, right, or whatever. But however far you go, everything has been tainted by sin. The creation, though, will be set free from that slavery one day. And let me read how God's going to do this. 2 Peter 3:13. I got two more verses to show you, and then we'll be closing. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13 says, as soon as I can get to it, 2 Peter 3:13 says, but according to his promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Now, how is this going to happen? Back up to verse 12. Looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be destroyed by burning and the elements will melt with intense heat. God is going to somehow, it's like in Colossians, God, the Son holds everything together. He holds everything together. The reason the chair is the way it is, the reason you and I are, because he's the glue that holds us. One day he's going to remove his hand. And the moment he does that, everything is it's going to be like a huge universe nuclear explosion. And everything is going to be destroyed and gone away with. At that point, last verse here, Revelation 21:1. When he lets go and you have this huge physical, material explosion of fire all throughout all of existence. Everything is burned up. And then Revelation 21:1 says this, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. Yeah, it was blew up in fire. And there is no longer any sea. So then he creates a brand new heaven and a brand new earth. That means everything at this point, everything past, all that was tainted by sin, humanity, well, I'm talking Christians here. Christians and obviously the saints of the Old Testament, the saints throughout the tribulation, and all of creation will no longer have a speck of sin on it. The only problem you're going to see, well, that we won't see but may be aware of, are those who rejected Jesus. They will be in an isolated container, an abyss, if you will, and they will abide there eternally in a form of destruction, the lake of fire. But other than that, everything else will be all sin, and all of what sin has done will be done away with.
Do you think we're going to remember the people that...
Do I think we're going to remember the people that are not in heaven? You know, I can't help but think the mind we have now is the mind we're going to have up there. But the difference is that we will be in a purified state. So there won't be any blame. There won't be any sorrow. There won't be any of that. Yeah, I think the purified state of absolute purity of joy and peace and righteousness won't allow for any heartbreak or turmoil or guilt. Yeah.
When exactly is Judgment Day?
So Judgment Day is Revelation chapter 20. And what happens is you have remember the old covenant, the prophets prophesied that there was going to be a millennial reign where the king was going to reign on earth, right? That's why when Jesus came, they said, hey, here's your crown, let's go. Ride the donkey. I mean, you're the king. He's like, no, not yet. We had to go to the cross first. So when Jesus comes back in Revelation 19 at the end of the 7-year tribulation, he is going to then step into a 1,000-year millennial reign where he's going to reign in Jerusalem as king. He has to do it because he's got to fulfill the old prophets. And once the millennial reign is done, then is the judgment. That's when heaven and earth are wiped away, and there's the great white throne judgment for the lost. Not for the believer, but for the lost. So it immediately comes right after the 1,000-year millennial reign. Yep. Revelation 20 into 21. Yep. The end of chapter 20, I should say. 20 and 20. Any final questions? Yes.
It sounds as if that we will be there watching that judgment.
Yeah, sounds like we might be there. I'm going to repeat your question for the camera. Yeah, it sounds like we might be there for the judgment. And, you know, I know that we won't be part of the judgment because the Christian has been judged at the cross, right? Jesus took our judgment. So we will have a reward, which was called the Bema seat, right? But this great white throne judgment, we won't be there. Are we going to watch it? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe we will be the ones who willingly go to our knees, and they will be the ones forced to their knees. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's a curiosity. Yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest with you. I don't think God would probably shield us from that. Yeah. Yeah, there's a marriage supper of the Lamb. Yeah. Yeah, that marriage supper is actually during the tribute. Yeah. Yeah, at the rapture, I mean.
Eating in heaven.
Yep. What is
Talked about eating in heaven.
Beth Moore talked about eating in heaven? Yeah. Yeah. You know, it seems like it, but I don't know that it's within the same context that we are in today. You know what I mean? But it definitely seems like that seems to be some part of it. So yeah, or the tree. Yeah, that could be. It could be. Yeah, all that stuff God did in the old covenant wasn't in vain. There's reasons for everything he did. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We don't have to worry about weight. You know what I mean? Because we'll have this. You know, and here's why, guys. You're going to wear that robe of righteousness. It'll cover everything. That robe of righteousness will cover you up. Eat as much as you want. Problem is eternity down the road, you start working your way out of that robe, you just go get a bigger one. No keto up in heaven, right. Yes, John.
How about Lazarus? Didn't
Yes.
see somebody else that was in hell, considered in hell?
Yeah, it looks like the rich man and Lazarus. Yeah, and along with Abraham. Yeah, there was a, but that is no longer in existence today. That temporary holding spot for the Old Testament saints has been removed. Jesus set the captives free after he went to the cross. So it'll be different for us. We won't be able to see over into a different area. Yeah. All right, yes.
Yeah, there's a verse. I was looking at Zechariah 14.
Yeah, yep.
Can I read something to you?
Yeah, please do. Zechariah 14, yep.
It says this, verse 14, verse 1. Behold, the day of Yahuwah comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. For I shall gather all nations against Hushaim to battle, and the city shall be taken. And the houses rifled with women gathered from half the city shall go forth into captivity. And the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall Yahuwah go forth and fight against those nations which he fought in the day of battle. And his feet, this is Yahuwah's feet, shall stand in that day in Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem in the east of Mount Olives, and shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there should be a very great valley